Hi, my name is Jordan. I am a special education teacher from the UK. I share my passion for everything communication, sensory regulation, and fun lesson ideas for my classroom of disabled pupils aged 4 to 11. Each week, I am joined by experts in the field, answering your questions and sharing our knowledge and experience working alongside our beautiful young people. Let's get started. Hello everybody and welcome to another podcast. Today I am joined by Ruth, a speech and language therapist who shares everything affirming and AAC related on social media. Hello Ruth.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. I think yours was one of the first accounts that I started following last year when I began sharing all of this kind of stuff. And I was so inspired by your affirming approach. That's been a real target for me this year, to get more affirming and purposefully more affirming, not just what I used to think was the kindest thing, but actually really purposeful and really putting in training and research into, what does affirming mean? Yeah, so that's how I would describe you and your account, but do you want to say a little bit about yourself and how you got into the space?
Yeah, I'm a speech and language therapist, and I have only ever really worked with additional needs, neurodivergent children and young people. And I guess kind of after the birth of my first child, I went part-time and started exploring independent practice and working kind of what we know as privately. And I, up until last year, was working employed and a little bit of private practice. And I found that I was working less and less with other speech therapists and really missing that space of like coming back to a therapy team and reflecting together. And so I suppose for me, that's what social media became, was just the space to kind of share some of those reflections, like some of those bits and pieces that I might find useful to share with other people during my day. And that's still what I use it for, really. I don't really know why I have social media. I guess it's just that connection piece that's...
Absolutely. It ends up as a really amazing staff room of people that you create in your pocket at all times to either share your findings with and celebrate, because it's really important to celebrate the wins as well, isn't it? Rather than to an empty room. It's really exciting to share it with people that get how big these small steps are, is really great. But yeah, to ask advice, and like I've learned so much this year just from kind of putting myself out there. From all of you guys really, who all have a speciality in different things. You can kind of build up this incredible team of people all over the world as well.
Yeah, I think there's something really, I guess for me, I'm saying I don't know why I have it. Part of it is probably because I feel strongly about the shift in practice that I think should happen for our neurodivergent children, young people and adults. And I guess it's kind of having that space to share some of those reflections and thoughts, isn't it? And build a like-minded network and learn from each other when, sometimes continuing professional development opportunities, they're really expensive. And, when we recognize some of the barriers to that in terms of privilege, in terms of position within education or within therapy, and access to that paid training is so difficult. And for parents to get access to professionals, yes, you can't give individual advice, but if there's just a space that might just offer somebody a little nugget of something where they go, oh, I could do that differently, or, oh, that could really benefit a child I work with or my child. Yeah, I think that's one of the joys of social media, really, isn't it? And, having space to kind of open some critical conversations about things as well.
Yeah, it's crucial. And that's definitely started me on my more affirming journey, because I thought I was, but until we very rarely get to watch or observe other people in our job, it's quite a lonely existence, really. And same for speech and language therapists and same for special ed teachers. You're kind of locked in the room and off you go, and you think you're doing the best. You go on the odd training day maybe, but you don't really get to see other teachers in practice. So when I was seeing teachers on social media talking about that they were doing this practice, that practice, and I thought, I need to learn more about this. Like, I could do better. And I think that's really great mindset to have as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's, I don't know who said it, but I've definitely seen a quote that one of the most dangerous things in language is, but we've always done it this way. And I feel actually that's so much of what we do in education, globally in education, but also within sort of additional needs, is just that's just what we've always done. And I think there's so many practices where if we just take a step back, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges within education. I was only talking to some teaching assistants and teachers today about having space to take that step back. And again, that's a bit of a privilege, really. It isn't afforded to so many people. But it's really important to work in an affirming way, because actually it is taking that step back and thinking about what's going on and how we're doing things and why we're doing things. It's something I don't have an easy answer to, but it's so much on my radar, is like the well-being of staff within education sector and how that then impacts on capacity to be affirming or to learn about affirming practice. And those things feel really interlinked.
It's hard, isn't it? Because the unaffirming practices look like they work in some regard. So you might be coming from a place where you think, but it worked for this child or that child. You've got these stories in your mind. I worked for 15 years in special ed before I started thinking about affirming practice consciously. So I've got years of experience, but that helped him to communicate. That helped her to, access things. And I think that's the danger, isn't it? Is, yes, these systems sometimes do help children communicate, but at what cost? And I think that's the question that we need to now ask ourselves, and more people are asking, thank goodness. It definitely seems like there's a massive shift in the speech and language world, if you will, in special ed, is at what cost? That's the question that we're asking ourselves. So yes, we want them to communicate, but at what cost? Does hand over hand practices, yes, it might teach them what we're expecting, but is it through control and compliance rather than actually what leads them? And that they're the kind of questions that we're asking ourselves. I've certainly noticed the shift. Have you seen that similar shift more recently, or has that been happening for years?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I reflect back on things. And so when I first qualified in 2010, and it was like, there were particular trainings that everyone went on, there were particular practices, particularly with non-speaking, minimally speaking children. There were things that we did. And then I remember learning about aided language input as like a method of teaching. And there was this video on YouTube that I used to use in training, and it's like a cartoon video, and there's like a child who walks along with their like device, and it's like, and nobody was using the device, and so the child didn't use the device, and then it's like the video is like, and then everyone started using the device, and now they're and I used to use that a lot in training and kind of think about things differently, and core boards and core vocabulary, which have been around for years, but they just, particularly, I've only ever really worked very specifically in the early parts of my career in the autism field. So I was in specialist residential provisions for high support needs autistic children. And so I just don't think that was part of it, because it didn't have that gold standard evidence base. Or maybe it did, I don't know, it just wasn't the thing.
Yeah, that's it. I think it's just the thing. It's how it's always been done. That's exactly what you said, right? This is what we've always been done. This is the training we've been on and that we've spent lots of money on. So this is what we're going to do. And I think that's where you get into that cycle of, rather than questioning and being curious about, actually, is this actually helpful?
And I inherited a caseload, and most of them were using certain communication systems, and that's what we worked on. And then I kind of did some reading, I did some learning, and I was like, we can get like, firstly, devices. That was the thing that started to come about. Like when I trained, iPads didn't exist. So this is all very new. And AAC devices were like typewriters and, things like that. So it became accessible via iPads. So we started looking at that. And then I started seeing kids using these devices. And I was like, well, hang on, if they can use it, what about their peers who maybe could access paper-based systems? Even if we don't have that level of privilege and access to funds for a device, we could try it this way. And some of the sessions we used to have where we'd go along and do aided language input and like model different verbs, for example. And suddenly kids, instead of saying like, I want the toy, they're saying go and stop and I like it. Within 20 minutes, you've given them so much more additional vocabulary. And it's like, that became really powerful. And I think then when we started to see progress and I could deliver training with the teams, and I had an incredible team, particularly I worked with some incredible speech therapy assistants and occupational therapy assistant who would just like hammer it home whenever they were going into their sessions. They were like my like aided language champions. And the progress we saw in some of those kids so quickly, and they're the ones where you think, gosh, like we made that shift a long time ago. This is like, 10 years ago now. But how many kids before that have missed out on language?
And you can't think like that, can you? Because I think we trained a similar year. Mine was 2009. So yeah, we trained in a similar year. And now, if I keep catching myself thinking, if only I knew then what I know now, because I think of this child and that child, I didn't quite reach them, or I could have done more. And I think, but what about the children in 10 years' time?
Yeah.
How much are we going to know then? And I think we just need to kind of accept our own journey, don't we? But I totally fall into that trap too. I don't know if you find this. I started using AAC on high-tech devices, so on iPads, 2 years ago, but only with 2 students, and it came to us through a speech and language referral, which is how we kind of got introduced to all this whole world of it, really, and which is amazing. But it was used with 2 students that had always done the system that we're talking about, so the hand over hand kind of visual system in a book. And that's mainly around requesting, right? So like you say, I want this, I want this. There's no real base for just commenting on life, really, is there? And what I noticed was that was then their automatic use of their high-tech iPad. So even though they had thousands of words all accessible to them and we were modelling, their go-to was at snack time and I want. And it wasn't a communication. It was very much, I press this button as a rigid routine and then I open the packet myself. Like there was no initiation for relationship. There was no drive to build that rapport. It wasn't there. It was very much rigid routine, press button, open packet. And then since then, we've now got iPads for all of my learners in my class, and we're seeing it's done so differently, even though we've not changed, with learners that have never gone through that system that are doing this fresh right from the start. They've got all the words. We're seeing so much fringe vocabulary, so much commenting, sentence building, gestalt, long language process, phrases, really exciting stuff. And I just think, wow, it really does have an impact. But I'm really pleased that it was started. I'm really pleased that they did it. I'm sure it's never too late. Are you seeing that kind of thing as well?
Yeah, I think in my experience, I've worked with some significantly prompt dependent children because of particular approaches to their whole behaviour, like not just to the communication. And I think sometimes what we can do is kind of reward the personality out of somebody, in terms of what we expect. And I think, when you listen to particularly the autistic community, there are some adults who really advocate for approaches that they say really, really helped them. So this is not we have to use nuance and we have to use critical thinking skills when we're looking at different children and how we're going to support them. But when you listen to the lived experience of the adult community, on the most part, they kind of talk about the challenges that these sorts of approaches give. And in my clinical experience and what I've seen is, I would agree, at the time when you're implementing it, it's like, wow, this is incredible. And I think that there is opportunity for other kind of, like you say, sort of different functions of communication further down the line. But I think it's not just the functions of communication, it's the way, the method of teaching. And for me, communication starts with connection, and that connection can be without any AAC just to start with. And I work with children now. I have such a privilege to work with children long term. And so I could work with them for years, and you just build that connection. And when you build that connection and you join them in what they are kind of what they're tuning into and what they're enjoying, and you then can make communication, even without AAC, you make it fun and you make it meaningful and you make it individualized. I find then when you start to map on AAC tools, paper-based or device-based, because I'm not one of those people that's like devices are best. There are different tools for different people, but devices are great. You see so much progress because you've done that connection piece and that joyful piece and that fun and that kind of tuning in and not kind of leading. And I think there's so much to be said for that approach of like child-led, where we can just see and observe and be with children and what's kind of getting them going, because that's where you need to tune in with starting to teach communication. And I think back, again, to sessions I would have run, and we'd have run some brilliant sensory sessions that kids just got to choose what they want, and we kind of had a nice structure of a start point and an end point and like little bits of sensory circuits. And then I'd have other sessions where you would just be like going with the same activity, and like requesting, for like a piece of Mr. Potato Head. And I'm like, is there any wonder why perhaps at times kids just didn't want to engage? And so I think that's been a real shift for me over the years. But I think also one thing I sort of wonder is how much I'm in my little happy bubble with my bubble of social media that tells me everybody's doing the same thing. And, you know, it can't be the case, can it? Because not everybody's following the same algorithms, getting the same information.
Yeah, it's definitely true that it can become an echo chamber, can't it, of affirming practices, especially when it's at your work, it's at your home, it's in your pocket, in your social media, it's your friendship basis. It definitely feels like a wonderful bubble. And it's a shock when your bubble gets burst, and it does sometimes. Like you end up on the wrong algorithm, or you sometimes in DMs as well, you get kind of comments or messages that aren't quite worded, you know, as you would word them, or, you know, whatever. And it does. It bursts the bubble for sure, doesn't it? And you think, there's still a long way to go. And actually, that's what drives me to keep going. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah. Well, I think that's it, because you think, gosh, what's the point? Because everybody's doing it. And then suddenly you're like, no, they're not. And, you know, I think it's hard, isn't it? Because I do think that this feels like the right way. But equally, I see the barriers and the challenges that different intersections and marginalised communities experience, and equally that the pressures on the education system. So it's lovely kind of going, oh, well, let's just do child-led practice, you know, or even my speech therapy colleagues who work for the health service and have caseloads that are huge, like they don't have that same capacity to do that sort of work and to work alongside staff teams in the classrooms every week, you know, those kinds of things that, and I think that then becomes the challenge. And then I kind of get myself being like, right, we'll petition the government and we'll do all these things, because it just doesn't feel good enough. And there's that kind of balance, I think, between having the impact for those few children that you can, you know, like for your class, for my caseload, and hoping that the practice filters through in the settings that they're in, and equally then having this little space on social media for anyone who wants to join along to be like, here's some information, you know, and that parents can take to their, you know, children's teachers and TAs. And I think it's providing like critical conversation, isn't it? It's not saying like everything you're doing is wrong, but just have you kind of, again, taken that step back and looked at what is going on and why.
Because I love the most affirming practices, but then I've also been in conversations where they're clearly not doing it in a child-led way, even though that's what the training says, even though I couldn't imagine a world in which you could get it wrong, but ultimately, of course you can. You know, if you're doing it, you could do anything. You could, I mean, God, intensive interaction, for example, I feel like is so child-led. I mean, God, they're literally like showing you what to do. They are literally leading the session. But if you're getting too close to a child too quickly, taking their toys from them and trying to use them, or rearranging their play too quickly, mimicking them when they're clearly distressed, all those kind of things can look like you're doing intense interaction, but clearly isn't child-led, clearly isn't affirming. I say clearly, maybe it isn't. And that's why we need to be having these conversations. So not just mentioning these words and mentioning this training, but repeatedly, so that we can keep the open conversation of, well, what actually is it? What actually does it look like? And it's really hard because none of us can actually share our real sessions with our real children. And I do say, you know, my attention autism sessions look very different with my group. Like, because like people say, you know, do all your children sit down on chairs and just what? No. Some are laying, some are pacing in and out, some choose not to join. That's cool. It's okay, but it's really hard to show that, isn't it? Yeah, you can give the impression of quiet, sit down, and actually, of course, that isn't what it is.
No, the reality is very different, isn't it? And I think that's one thing, you know, that's another practice that I feel like I love the kind of, you know, that irresistible invitation. That's the kind of phrase I always take from that approach, and kind of curiosity, isn't it? But equally, I think that's the sort of approach where, again, people take it and they deliver it in such a rigid way where there is this set of expectations, and actually that then takes something and turns it into really quite not affirming practice.
Compliance, control, and everything. And I think that was my fear of even using that whole system in the first place. But speaking to the directors, it was really interesting. I had them on the podcast and I really was kind of use it to like, can you convince me that this is a good thing? Because I'm not convinced. And they totally did. They were like, no, that isn't what we teach at
Mm-hmm.
all. They said we had one photo of all the children sat down. We've never spoken about it. We just had one photo in an advert, and all of a sudden, and all of these kind of things. I think, yeah, it can really be twisted, can't it? Like
And I think,
lots of these things.
yeah, and I think partly again that goes back to access to training, because how many people would have been on attention autism training, but actually it isn't the approach training. So they've been on something that's kind of talking about attention autism, and but it isn't necessarily delivered by the official folks, and then it does sometimes the message gets lost because the
But
focus
it is
switches.
also okay to question the big dogs as
Mhm.
well. Like, don't just assume because they're the director or they're the big thing that everyone's talking about, because we've had lots of other big things that lots of
Yeah.
people are talking about and using. Like, let's question it. And I love one of my TAs the other day. Like, again, we can get so institutionalized accidentally, can't we? That for hello time, we had an iPad and we had good morning on it, and our PMLD students would come in and we'd show them, and they'd reach for it and they'd say good morning, always in the same voice, always a female voice, and they're male, all these things, and we'd just do it every morning. Oh, that's lovely. And my TA even said they might not have had a good morning. They might not want to say good morning. Are we giving them another option to not say good morning? And why is it a girl's voice? We need to get one of the year 5 boys to do it, all of this.
Yeah.
And I love her for that so much, because sometimes you just need someone to question, and all of a sudden it popped me out of my bubble and I thought, yeah, you're so right.
Yeah.
What is the purpose of this? Why are we starting with good morning for a start? Like, that's not functional.
No.
All of these it started unraveling all this questioning. And that was only
Mm-hmm.
recently, and it's already changed so much around that session, and what
Yeah.
what is actually what we're using it for.
Mm-hmm.
What's the purpose? It really questioned it. Just that little question. So don't think just because they're the teacher, or because they're the speech and language therapist, or because they're the system that everyone's using that's on their EHCP, don't think you can't question it, because that is really healthy to be curious. And they might say, oh, it's because of this, and have a really good answer, and then that's fine. But it's always good to be curious, because sometimes those questions make change, make
Mm-hmm.
really good change.
Yeah, they do. And I think for me, there's something around, like, I truly believe that everybody is equal around the table, that team around the child. And I think sometimes ego comes into it, and people feel, I don't want to say attacked, that maybe feels a bit strong, but like, if there's a question, it's a bit like, well, because I said, or because I know. And you think, no, actually it's not. It needs to be a critical conversation where we're exploring these things. And maybe we need to look internally if we are that person that feels discomfort when somebody challenges something we've said, and what shows up for us in those moments, and how do we manage that? Because actually everybody's got a right to share an opinion, and to engage in a dialogue about strategies and approaches. And I think sometimes that's not always
Yeah.
not always welcomed by everybody, is it? Because it
Yeah,
makes them
and
feel
it's part of the
uncomfortable.
exactly. Of course it does, and it affects your self-esteem, or
Yeah.
whatever is going on for you. But it is definitely part of the job, isn't it? The fact is there is a team around the child. There's the parents, the teachers, the therapists, social workers. All these children naturally come with a big team around them, and if we're all saying different things, even if they're all the right things, just the fact that they're different will make them so much less effective, won't they? I remember an EHCP meeting I had about 10 years ago. I don't know why it comes to mind, but it's just a perfect example of this. That we went through all the HCP targets, and the mum said, okay, so right, but what do we start with then? You want me to do music to get them in and out of the taxi? You want me to, get him dressing and do this? And we were like, oh, no, not all at once, before he's 25. It's really easy to all think our goals or our targets are the most crucial, right? And we kind of
Yeah.
need to look at this big picture and
Yeah.
think, yeah, but what's first? Like, what does the child need right now? What will have the biggest impact?
I
Because
was
we
only
all kind of get lost in that, don't we?
Yeah, I think it's so easy. I was only talking to a parent today about an EHCP review, and saying, like, actually the goal setting is really quite boring bit of it, because really what we want to talk about is the here and now, not like at the end of the key stage or the next transition point. You want to be like, okay, like, what is going on now? What's, like, the goal for in the next 6 weeks. And I think that's again one of those things with kind of the privilege of time that is afforded to some settings and not to others, to explore that and have those conversations. Because really, you know, as a therapist, I might be looking at setting goals for like 12 weeks, maybe more, maybe less, maybe, you know, sometimes I feel like I kind of half set goals and just sort of wander along and see what happens in that time. And, you know, inevitably progress happens and change happens, but it might not be quite what you planned it to be, particularly with more complex, you know, high support needs individuals, because how do you know what they might achieve? You know, we've talked, haven't we, about when you get that AAC tool right and what you thought,
oh my goodness, yes,
they know, and they show us they know, then you're like, whoa. And yeah, it sort of blows your goals out of the water, which is great.
absolutely. And you see it time and time again, don't you? I say it a lot. I don't know if you feel like this as well, but I say I'm not really a teacher, I'm just a facilitator, and I just put together activities that I think will allow them to show me what they already know, rather than activities where they are learning this new skill. Often it's like, do you know this? What about if I do this? And if I do this, can you do it? Like, it really does feel like that. It's almost like they're like a wrapped present and we're kind of like slowly undoing the ribbon. Like, it's all there. It's just, like, how can you show us? You know, what can we do to help you show us what you know? And yeah, I mean, high-tech AAC has been a huge unraveling for us in my classroom. It's really been quite exciting because it has allowed my students to show us what, like, even just part of what they can do and what they know, which is really exciting.
It's when you see the personality come through. I think that's the thing. Like, working with a child a couple of years ago, and we introduced AAC, and this particular child's big into dinosaurs, we're playing with the dinosaurs, and I like pick up one, I'm like, oh, triceratops, and then like they were saying like not triceratops, like looking, laughing, you know, like joking, basically joking. And
yeah, that's a joke. Yeah, that is a joke. Yeah.
Like that. And then it became the game, you know, was that I'd pick something up and say it was this, and then they'd say not that. And we were like, had so much joy in that interaction, and so much communication was happening, but it was so meaningful and it was so fun. And you think that child would not have access to the vocabulary triceratops, or even not, you know, like that word is often, we don't think about rejecting and protesting when we kind of set up AAC tools, and historically. And I think it's really powerful when you see it. Even years ago, I remember working and we were introducing AAC to a child on a device. And the teacher like phoned me down, and they were really quite distressed, the child. And so I kind of ran over and I was like, I'll bring the iPad and we'll just see. And the child like had some vocalizations. And so they were making a vocalization. The teacher said, oh, they mean, I think they were saying like, oh, they mean bedroom. Like, I've told them that it's not time for their bedroom. We're going to stay, like, it's classroom time. It's a residential setting. So kind of bedroom was right there. And we got the device and the child said, bus, bus, bus. And the teacher was like, oh my God, we were meant to go on the minibus, but like we couldn't because of something else. And you're like, okay. So then we like quickly wrote a social story, and this child just literally, you could watch them deflate, like from severely agitated, really, really quite distressed. And I was like, but they didn't have the word bus. And we're presuming that they meant bedroom because of that vocalization.
And then how frustrating.
No wonder that they were so distressed. Like, and another one I remember introducing on an iPod Touch, like, and this again was quite a long time ago. And this particular child had taken the device home over a holiday and came back, and the parent was saying, oh, you wouldn't believe it, they asked for blackcurrant. And this child was like 15, and they were like, I've just always presumed the noise meant apple juice, and that's what they had. So for 15 years, this child had been drinking apple juice. And this parent was like, wow. And like, how powerful is that? Like, they obviously didn't mind the apple juice, but equally that noise was kind of presumed that apple juice was what they meant. And then when you had this different set of vocabulary that they got, suddenly it's like, oh, now they can try some blackcurrant juice. And you're like, yeah. And that's the power of a varied vocabulary, isn't it?
Yeah.
And like robust systems, as opposed to kind of, you know, systems where we don't necessarily get that breadth of language and that breadth of vocabulary, and that capacity to share things internally.
Yeah, and symbols get eaten, chewed, ripped apart, lost, and then it takes you, well, at least 24 hours to make it again, if not way longer. And then they've lost their voice for all that time.
Yeah.
It's just, it's really tricky, isn't it? Yeah, and I can't even imagine how frustrating it is. I once did one day of not speaking for a day to raise money for charity, and I failed completely. I spoke about 10 times in the day. It's so hard when it's your like first means of communication. So yeah, I just think they're amazing, and how well they communicate when minimally speaking or non-speaking as well. Like, they really do get their needs known. And it may not be the safest or appropriate way, but they definitely get their needs known for the most part. And I really give them credit for that. It's incredible how they find ways to communicate what they need and want, which is just basic needs, isn't it?
Yeah.
I really hope that through this affirming practices that mental health figures improve as well. I was reading some awful percentages today that will with analytical learners, 1 in 10, will have some kind of mental health struggle in their life. That's just a standard. And then if you have a neurodivergence or a cognitive disability, it's 1 in 4. And then if you have a physical disability on top of that, it's 85%. And they don't even know the figures really, because these kids aren't easy to get medical research for that from.
Yeah.
But they've done enough to work out that it's at least 85%. I mean, they're horrifying numbers. Like, I can't hear that and want to make a change.
Absolutely.
And then thinking back to your child that you were just talking about that was distressed and couldn't have words, well, surely communication and regulation are the start of improving mental health. Surely.
Yeah, I think it's got to be. And I think it's then almost again taking that step back of okay, so what's the lens through which we're viewing these difficulties, and how do we then kind of support that communication and regulation? And I think that is then part of the bigger conversation around behavior support and the narrative through which we view the way that some of these children show up at times. I recently did an inset day training at school. I was talking to them about how, you know, Ross Green's work, particularly around ADHD children, but I think it is for all children, in my view, that kids do well when they can. And I think for me, that is so powerful, because if a child is not doing well, you know, firstly, whose expectation is what is well? And that's a question in itself. But then if they're not, like, we need to look at what's going on around them, right? And thinking about their internal state, those basic needs, are they met? Can they communicate that? Do they feel safe and secure? Do they feel, you know, are they fed? Are they watered? Like, have they had a good rest?
Hot?
Do they need the toilet? Do they know if they need the toilet? You know, are they uncomfortable? Exactly. And I think we then kind of look at that, and then the next piece around them becomes that, okay, so how do we work out what's going on and then teach them the ways to regulate that and communicate that? And also thinking about, for me, part of that is the environment and that inclusive communication environment that's going on. But I also think sometimes the activities, you know, like I see some kids who perhaps are presenting as not doing so well, and that kind of challenging time. But I think, is that because the activity is too hard or not hard enough, and therefore they're a bit disinterested and creating their own entertainment?
Or too overstimulating or understimulating and not interesting.
That's it. And I think also for me, part of that is also recognizing that fluctuating capacity of neurodivergent kids, right? Because they might be able to do something one day that they can't do the next day, or even in the morning that they can't do in the afternoon. And that, for a lot of people, can be quite baffling. But if we take an affirming approach and an honoring approach, it is about believing kids, tuning in and getting to know them, and getting to know when are those times to perhaps push and perhaps kind of encourage a bit more, and when are the times to just go, that's cool, I can see you're done, we need to focus on that regulation piece, let's bring your energy back in line, whether it's too low, too high, to get you in a better place, and then we'll see what's next, you know? And I think for me, so much of that affirming practice around communication starts at that level, you know, starts at taking a step back and just seeing what's going on, and believing kids, you know, there's so much power in validation around just listening, isn't there? And I think that's the case for any kind of level of learner and support needs. You know, I could work with some really high support needs kids, and they might be, you know, communicating through self-injurious behavior, their frustration, and just being able to validate, say, it's really frustrating. You know, I think there's sometimes this view in our minds that actually children don't have capacity for language and don't have capacity for understanding because of their lack of expressive language. And yeah, they might not in that moment, but we can teach it, and we have to believe that they have capacity to understand it. So that kind of validation and giving,
Yeah.
my supervisor, Kate Boot, talks about language for experience. And I think that's it. It's like actually in those moments, giving some language to the experience that they're having and honouring how they're showing up, and then thinking about that step back and what do we need to do next time to support communication and regulation in those situations.
So would it look like naming maybe what they're expressing? So I can see you're frustrated that you can't do this. Like, is that what it sounds like?
Yeah, I mean, for me, sometimes it sounds like that. There is challenge, isn't there, in trying to name emotions for somebody
because then
else,
how do you know? Yeah, so how do you navigate that?
Usually what I find myself saying is like, this seems tough, or it's hard.
I like that.
Some things I can see this is tricky. I sometimes will, on an AAC device, like we use quite a lot of grid and Smartbox, but anything, they've got one on their messages that's just something's wrong. And so I might just model that, like, I think, and say something's wrong.
Yeah, because that's not putting on to them what they're feeling. It's just, I can see something's wrong. And it's that is clear. Yeah. And it's just, that's still validating, isn't it? That I can see something's wrong, i.e., can I help in any way?
And sometimes I would just say, like, I'm here.
Yeah.
Like, you know, and I do that on a device. I do that with my language. I do that with my body language, you know, and just be like, I'm here and I'm going to, you know, you're safe. Like, it will be okay. But so you can give like language, I think, that kind of validates the experience and links in with their experiences, but also can kind of reassuring, nurturing in those moments. But generally, like, again, that's a practice years ago. I've been like, we label the emotions and like show them the symbol. And now I'm like, okay.
No, that makes so much sense to me. I've always struggled with how to say it. So that makes so much sense. And I feel like maybe the more we do that, it then becomes easier to find that language, to find that script that isn't putting on them what they may not be feeling, and yet still showing them that you've shown up for them.
Yeah. And I think, like, so often, you know, the difference between anxiety and frustration, like, how do we know that their frustration is not driven by anxiety? And so I think, you know, and some of these kids, they don't necessarily have the skills at this point in time to talk about what it was, but there is sort of comfort in validation.
Yeah.
And one of the things I talk a lot to staff about is our natural reaction, say, it's okay. And actually what I'm trying to get people to say, it's not okay.
Yeah.
Because again, that's language for their experience that they're having. So I think we can say, like, I can see it's not okay. You know, I can see it's tricky. Like, I'm here. You're safe. It will be okay. You know, those kinds of things. Yeah. And again, you know the children you're working with to tune in and know how much language is too much.
I mean, that's the point as well, isn't it? That if you've got a good relationship and a trusting relationship with this child already, which is what I would like, it has to be that way. Then they will also know that you mean best as well. So even if you get it wrong or you're too close or whatever, if you've got that trusting relationship, there's a little bit more leniency there, a little bit that you can kind of work it through together. Whereas if you come in and you haven't got those trusting relationships, you haven't built that connection yet, it's going to be really tricky. And even if you are saying the right things and doing the right things, it's going to be really hard for them to trust that you in that moment when they're completely in fight or flight mode. Yeah, so it's so important that when in just taking every opportunity to build those connections, and that looks like being led by them, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And validating and you know, sort of sharing their joy and also being there when it's not so joyful.
Yeah, not just being there, not just showing up when it's crisis.
No.
I feel like it's really easy to fall into those traps with certain peoples that they just get on, they're just there in the background, just chilling. They do their transitions. They're pretty happy. They're pretty independent. Like everyone, well, maybe not everyone's got one in the class. I've certainly got children like that in my class. Yeah, and they just kind of get on, and it's so easy to focus on the crisis in that moment, which is very rarely them. And actually, they're missing out. And if they learn that the only way I get help, or the only way I can build a connection or interaction with you, even if it's not a nice one where I feel in control of myself, my body, maybe they're going to do that. And then maybe you'll start seeing some unsafe behaviors just through lack of attention. Really, it's what it comes down to. I've certainly seen that in every single one of my classes, and it's such an easy trap to fall into, and it's certainly one that I'm very conscious of in my class at the moment, and something that we're working really hard to not happen. Yeah, we're seeing some behaviors bubbling up, and the only thing I can think of is, well, yeah, of course they are. It's how they get interaction. It's so simple in my mind. It might not be. Again, we're just guessing. We're being curious, but it makes sense to me that would be the thing. You know.
And then you take that step back, don't you? And then you think, okay, so if we put in a bit more one-to-one time for that child that's bubbling, and even if that's 5 minutes a day of just some intensive interaction or some child-led play, and see what happens. Because so often I think, we need the curiosity piece, but ultimately it becomes a hypothesis, doesn't it? And there are times where that hypothesis is untestable, like you can't work it out. And sometimes it's of the phase, maybe something's going on for that child internally that we can't see, we can't work out. And within a few days, things settle down again, Other times it's not. And you kind of have a chance to test the hypothesis and think, I wonder if it's this, let's do that a bit differently and see what happens. Or, like do the transition a little bit earlier or a bit later, or let's put in a social story and see if that helps, I think those kinds of things can be like really powerful. I was working with a family in the summer, and we had a situation around sleep, and kind of the parent had a hypothesis. And I said, well, look, let me write a social story about this hypothesis and we'll just see. And they read this social story and their child went back to sleeping. Like those moments where you're like, well, what's the worst that could happen?
Yeah, and it just doesn't make a difference. Well, you're no worse off, are you?
No. And so some of these things are worth exploring, aren't they, to test that hypothesis and just see like, oh, okay, like, is that going to benefit? Is that going to change the situation? And again, thinking about that kind of like, so is there something in the environment we change? Is it about the activities, or is it the way we're supporting? And I kind of think about that triangle really around the child in the centre is, let's look at those three different pieces and see if we can work out which bit we might need to shift.
The only thing it's not is changing them, right?
Yeah, because they're often not the problem.
And I think that's so often lots of settings, even if they're not really conscious of it, that's their first thought. Let's take the device away, it's distracting, or let's get them to sit down, or let's, whatever it is, it's changing system. Them.
They're not doing a reward system. Let's put in a reward system. So every time they sit down, we'll give them a sticker, and hopefully in time we will quash their sensory needs.
Yeah.
Into compliance, and I just think,
yeah, it's classic.
It is, isn't it? And I notice I'm sitting here now and I struggle to sit still, like it's a thing. And I think that we recognize, so often this thing is like, yeah, but in the adult world. And I think in the adult world, we have so much more autonomy over what we do, when we do, and how we do it. And equally, I think for some of these children with particularly high support needs, like they're going to be in a place where they probably have even more autonomy because they're, like my job before I was a speech therapist, I was a support worker and like house manager for adults with learning disabilities. And they had total autonomy. Like they would choose what they wanted to do every day. Like we would get them involved in things. And if they didn't want to get involved in the washing, they didn't
choose what they wanted to wear.
Yeah.
Do non-age appropriate activities. Like when did that become a thing? Let's change that sentence.
Yeah.
Like offer them choices. So like I have created a program and someone was saying, I work with secondary school age adults, like young people, but cognitively, like we're into other things. Is your program appropriate? And I was like, well, there's lots of options on there. There's pop music, there's rock music, there's TV adverts, there's Disney, there's Coco Melon. Like, give them options of everything and let them show you what's appropriate. I can't answer that for them.
No.
I've had children that love Beyonce. I've got a child in my class that loves classical music. give them all the options and they will show you. And I guess that's similar, that comes back round to speech and language as well, isn't it? One of my questions was, how do you get started? So you've got a minimally speaking child in your class, or a non-speaking child in your class, or even a child that speaks, but maybe if they're dysregulated, they kind of lose some of their words, maybe. How do you get started? Is it the same? Is it just like, just have available as much as you can and see what they gravitate towards and model it? Is that it?
Well, honestly, my like first therapy session, when I go to first meet a child, okay, I get a referral and I think, right, yeah, I can take this on. I would take a bag of stuff. I usually just put the bag down for a bit and just see, because that gives me some information about how safe that child feels. Are they initiating, looking in my bag? Are they not? It's like literally like a Tesco Minions bag for life that I take everywhere. It kind of gauges, it helps me gauge when a kid starts wanting to look in my bag and open it up. I'm like, okay, they're starting to feel safe because they're initiating some interaction with me and the things that I take. Sometimes I don't take anything and I would just go and see what they're doing in their environment. Often it can be tricky sometimes if you take too much equipment, because, you know, parents then might feel, or schools might feel, they've suddenly got to have all this stuff. So actually it can be quite helpful to work with what is in the setting. But I just see like, what are their interests, and I just observe and I just tune in. If they don't kind of initiate, I might see what are they using in their environment, what are they kind of gravitating towards. And some assessments I might be there for like an hour and a half, 2 hours, you know, and it is just about seeing and observing. Like, yeah, I'd take a range of different sensory and regulation tools. I'd take just some different toys, like the different, you know, spinny things and light up things, and, you know, sort of stacking things, and all sorts of different play schemas, you know, like things that lend itself to posting and, you know, all that kind of stuff, and just see like what they interested in. And then when they do, it's then about kind of gauging and tuning in, like being alongside them. Like, do you want me here? And then that's another opportunity, like particularly in a first session, sometimes you go a bit too close and you can see them look, or they may be pushed. Go away, Ruth. And I'll give them the
It's
language.
communication, right?
Yeah. So I'll say, like, go away. And I'll say, I'm sorry, like I got that wrong, you know, like, because I can model too that I'm learning. Again, that's kind of that safety and trust. It's just been like, yeah, I'm sorry. Actually, I can see that you needed me to go away. Like, give me some space. And I think that's kind of how I've generally approached that first session. And then I would come out and be like, okay, I've got in my head now where that child's at with those kind of foundation communications around joy and around play. And that's when I kind of think, okay, so what's next? How can we kind of map some communication strategies into these things that this child is into without also killing it?
Yeah, true. Yeah, because you don't. Yeah, true. It's such a balance, isn't it? Is it often you going into the environment that they know?
Yeah. I don't have a clinic, and even when I was an employed therapist, I'd usually go and be with them in a classroom.
Because that's a huge barrier, isn't it? Already, you're asking so much of them, aren't you?
Yeah. Transitions can be huge, you know, and while there is merit in being in a quiet environment, again, if we're thinking about honoring, affirming therapy practices, like how useful is it to get them to sit down and be like, put the, you know, the cup on the table, or brush the dolly, or feed the teddy? Like, I don't know, like I feel like I can gain information around what they understand by observing them in the classroom, and I can think about what cues are they picking up on and what visuals help them.
Yeah, and I
how
suppose
many
also,
instructions.
if they're in a quiet room when they're working with you, you could be able to do some wonderful things with them. But how, out of context, how useful is that when, but they work in a classroom or they work at home, or they,
Mhm.
that's their environment, so let's work there and see what's possible there.
Mhm.
I suppose I guess both have their pluses, but
Some sessions I do a bit of both. Like I might go in and into school and spend a bit of time in the classroom with the child, and then if we're feeling okay with the transition, but again, I'd offer them a choice. Like, do you want to come, or do you want to stay and see what they do, you know? Because also I think from a communication perspective, it's really beneficial for, if you're in the setting, for parents to see what you're doing and how you're doing it,
absolutely.
or for education staff, because therapy session is like a minuscule amount. And so if the people around the child aren't using those strategies the rest of the week, then we see such slow progress. Yet when we see everybody on board smashing those approaches, the progress just goes whoomp.
And I know as an educator, like I read so many speech and language reports, and I can kind of have an idea of what they mean. But them actually showing me with the child in the environment with the resources is so much clearer, and it makes it so much more doable and, you know, understandable for all of us to then feel confident to carry it on when they're not there. So yeah, showing rather than writing and reading is crucial.
Yeah, I think so. I do a lot of videos that I send to parents and teachers
Amazing.
about like, these are, you know, this is where you can find the vocab on the device, or like this is an activity you could try. Where I've got consent, I'll like video bits of sessions, say if I'm in school, that I can then send to a parent so they can see what I've been doing and how I'm doing it. And I think it's about making the resources accessible, which is why I do quite like paper-based AAC, because that is something that you can, like, you know, you can print out core vocabulary boards, like by the 10s and 20s, and laminate them and just sort of, you know, fritter them around as you're going on your
And they're freely
rounds.
available. Like,
Yeah.
search the symbol language program that you use or that your child knows or they know at school or is on their AAC or whatever.
Yeah.
There will be free ones
All of
available. Or
them.
contact the company. They all send you them. So don't let that be a barrier. Don't let the fact that you don't have this program or that program be a barrier to you. They will be freely available. Contact me or Ruth and we'll send you them. I don't want that to be a barrier to you not getting access to a paper-based copy. I mean,
and it's a simple way to start and explore. Like, for some kids, they might like throw it away, they might swish it away, but actually
simple for the adults to model as well, though, isn't it? Even if the child isn't interested, I think my TAs were much less nervous of a paper-based model than the iPad, and because it looked like our iPad, then they could transition over to that a little bit easier as well as they got confident in finding it. My core word sessions are really funny, actually, because so often the kids are just in and out getting ice. Oh God, we've got this new ice thing, and they're more in the freezer now than they are in my classroom, but whatever. So they're out getting ice and outside, whatever. And I've got 4 teaching assistants around me trying to find the words on the iPad. It's just brilliant. I love it. But yeah, that's how you learn, isn't it? We're all beginners at this. We're all learning.
And I think that's something that we don't necessarily give enough credit to. And, you know, people will like hang their hat on high-tech AAC. We're going to get the device. We're going to get the iPad. Like, it is actually like trying to learn a new language. So if you start with a paper-based core vocabulary board that is the same as usually the front page of most of those apps, you can get to grips with it without being so totally overwhelmed that you shelf the device because you think, I can never find the word, I don't know what I'm doing. And I think that is so important that we recognize for communication partners. Being a communication partner is a skill on so many levels. That tuning in, that noticing, that when to model, what to model, how to model.
Keeping it charged, keeping it not smashed. All of those things.
It just it can be a very overwhelming set of skills to develop. And I think that needs to, again, go back to well-being of people, actually just recognizing that, you know, there's a lovely quote from, I think it's like Buchelman, and it talks about AAC, like, if you gave someone a piano, they can't learn to be a pianist any more than if you give someone an AAC device, they're a communicator. We have to teach them. But actually that applies equally to adult communication partners, because we aren't just communicators with AAC just because we've got it. We need to play with it. We need to try it. Like, I remember introducing pod books at a school, which is pragmatic, organized, dynamic display. And I love pod. I think it's such a cool like approach. I really like the social pragmatic way that language is set up. And we had them in the staff rooms and in the therapy offices so people could play with them while we were kind of printing them out and getting them going. So people could just get used to it, because it was a very different way of that like core vocabulary, like language structuring sentences modeling. It was suddenly this like, I've got something to say, turn to a page, and, you know, so we just played about with them for a bit to get used to them.
And you're not just using one system in the class either, are you? So we've got 3 different AAC apps in my room, well, for 10 children, you know. So your muscle memory is learning one, and then you go to another child and you think, hang on a minute. You know. So
and that's a lot.
It is a lot.
It's a lot.
And it's definitely easier to not bother. Like, for us, it's easier for us to think, oh, like, we haven't got time, we need to go swimming, just get it, or I'll just do it for you. And it feels kind in the moment, but it just isn't. I'd rather be late for swimming. In fact, my lesson before swimming is, I've made it purposefully personal, social and emotional. So our lesson for a whole hour before swimming is just getting ready for swimming without prompting.
Yeah.
That's our lesson. And it's more of a lesson for us, to be honest. It's like, you are not allowed to say, check your timetable. You are not allowed to say, get your boots. You are not allowed to do up the zip for them. Be like, whatever it is. Just, you put on your coat, you get your boots, and just be one step ahead of them. Don't be like way ahead of them. Just be one step ahead, and keep repeating your little step until they get it, or whatever.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, that's it.
But I've got the luxury of having a school that completely trusts me to create whatever I can do whatever I want, which is such luxury. I speak to so many teachers that it just breaks my heart how rigid their schools are, and it's such a huge barrier. I think that some of the biggest barriers to these kids isn't finances, it's rigidity with senior leadership team, honestly.
Yeah.
They are so
curriculum.
scared of change. And I just think if you believe the kids, but also believe the teacher, believe the teaching assistant, when they say, I just need half an hour to do this, or I really want to go on this training, or I need an extra dinner lady at 12, between 12 and 10 past 12. I really need that extra person. Just believe them.
Yeah, and I think I was listening to a podcast actually, and it was Cary Grant and David Grant, and they were talking about basically, are you prepared to break the rules? Because in order to support complex needs, additional needs, neurodivergent children, you need to be prepared to break the rules. And I think that is something that is so powerful, because that's what we're doing ultimately, isn't it? And you can chain it all the way back to all sorts of complex social policies and things, but ultimately, like, schools need to break the rules and break the boundaries.
Yeah.
And I was only having a conversation literally this afternoon with a neurodivergent teenager about schools and how they could do better to support children if they delivered different kinds of lessons, talking about kids who are brilliant at gaming, who have like a lot of creativity, but actually schools' expectations for them to sit still and do all these lessons on repeat, and study subjects that aren't interesting to them. And again, it goes back to that. But in the adult world, most of us will pursue a hobby we enjoy. We will try and find a job.
That's more active, that's outdoors. Why do you have to wait until college to then start doing apprenticeship style stuff? It's really bizarre. It's definitely why I'm not a mainstream teacher and why I'm in special ed, because I am a rebellious. I am a problem solver. I can't see a problem in front of me and know a solution and not do it. Whether it's in the rules or not, that's just part of me. And in my old job, it got me in a lot of trouble. And in this job, luckily, they are far more trusting and just let me get on with it.
I don't think even special ed is always consistently like that.
Well, it's really not. I don't know. So my last school was special ed. My last school was special ed school.
Yeah.
And so and incredibly rigid, incredibly institutionalized, terrified of change, more terrified than the mainstream. I'm in a mainstream school now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I'm in a mainstream school in a special ed provision.
Oh,
so
okay,
they need the HCP to be there, but they're mainstream. Far more trusting. I think because they don't really have a clue what to do, so they're like, yeah, I'm sure she knows. Whereas in the special ed school, they kind of knew enough to have an opinion, but it was so outdated that it was really institutionalized and rigid and yeah, just terrified to make any changes. So yeah, don't think that this is mainstream versus SEN. It definitely isn't. It just is potluck as to how your school is, really.
Yeah, and equally, I think it goes back to what you're saying, doesn't it, about feeling comfortable and confident to challenge and do differently.
And that comes in time. Like, don't think. Like, as an ECT teacher, I didn't know what was right or wrong, or even what my opinion was. I was basically being dragged through my first few years by my teaching assistants, honestly. Yeah, exactly, by my legs. So there's no judgment at all. But after 15 years, you get to have quite strong opinions on what feels good and what is right, and you can challenge. But also equally, my teaching assistant I was speaking about earlier, she's been in the job a year. She's just really passionate about speech and language, doing her own research, through social media and online herself. And she's questioning, like, let's question. I want to build a world that people aren't scared to whistleblow or get it wrong or question or think outside the box or problem solve, because you have to, especially with the children that we're working with, because they don't follow the rules. They don't follow the linear typical stuff, so why should we, really?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that sums it up, doesn't it? That actually whatever approach, whether you're thinking about regulation, communication, education, and they all intertwine, they're not seen as silos, but it needs to be meaningful and it needs to be as individualized as it can be, as flexible, like not in that space of being like, this is what we do and this is how we do it. And yeah, I think that is going to take time, and I sit with a lot of frustration about that, because I feel like, why can't people just see this and do this? Like, what is the
Also,
barrier?
don't be afraid to leave a job.
Mm-hmm.
There's only so much change that you can make. Don't feel like you're letting the children down because you've got all these barriers around you that you're not able to make the change that you want to make. You can leave. It's okay.
Yeah.
Because actually there are so many children and young people out there that also need you. And I think that's okay. And I really struggled with leaving my last job. I really felt like I'd let the kids down. But now I've learned I never did. I did as best I could within the parameters that I was allowed, and now I've got an amazing class as well, and there's so much else that I could do there. So yeah, don't worry about that.
And I think ultimately you can't do a good job if you are burnt out from banging your head against the brick wall.
Yeah.
And if the system around you is not enabling you and that's impacting your well-being, then you aren't going to show up as the best education professional, therapist, TA, Senko, teacher, whichever part of that professional, that you fall into. It goes back to what we were talking about, that actually like thinking about the well-being of the education profession, and I mean that across all the roles is so important, because if we don't get that right, then the kids get inconsistency, they have staff off, they have like turnover, and all those things that then does hinder progress, because you're constantly, I see it as a therapist, the kids who've got a really secure, who are well supported, who have good well-being, they make loads of progress. The kids who are in classrooms and settings where that isn't the case, you're constantly going in as a therapist, but like, oh, here's another TA that I now need to
you're in survival mode all the time, because you're just trying to get through the day. You're never going to be able to add in all these wonderful extra things, are you? Well, not extra, these wonderful...
Just today basics. I was saying, if I come along as a happy speech therapist, like, try this strategy, they're going to want to punch me in the face. They're not going to be like, yes, please.
No, like, get your gloves on. We've got a pad that needs changing, Ruth. In you go. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I would absolutely wholeheartedly.
I could so see you would as well. I love it. Right, I think it's time to finish, but oh my goodness, I could chat to you for ages. I feel so affirmed. With all of these podcasts, I kind of use it as a CPD for myself, kind of like my own progression, talking to all these experts. And I'm definitely going to sit with, believe them, not only for the kids in my class, but also the teaching assistants, everybody. And I hope that filters up and down. Believe them. If someone says they need something, or if someone's showing you that they need or want something, it's probably because they do need it.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to take that into this week. So thank you for that wisdom. And where can everybody find you? Because I know they're going to want to follow you on all your things.
Yeah, I have a Facebook page and Instagram, and I do have TikTok. I don't use that so much though; it feels a bit scary. At Ruth, maybe _Jones_SLT. I think that's Instagram. Yeah.
I'll leave it in the description below. I'll leave it in the description. You'll find her.
Yeah, you will. And I love to connect with people and chat about all these kinds of things. So yeah, please do reach out, because it's just nice to have conversations with people and, critical dialogue, equally like-minded friends.
Absolutely. And no question is a bad question. There's no judgment if you use different words, whatever. We'll take it all. Yeah. I love actually having questions from people that use the kind of outdated language or whatever, because they're still doing the right things. I've come up on their algorithm for a reason. I'm pleased you're here. Like, let's work together. So yeah, no bad question is a bad question. Thank you so much, Ruth, for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I hope you have a really good week.
Yes, and you. Thank you.